Hey guys, so today I'm here with the Teraflex 2.5-inch Sport ST2 suspension lift kit with the Falcon 2.1 monotube shocks, fitting all 2007 to 2018 JK Wranglers. So a lift kit can offer you a number of different benefits as far as performance goes, as well as aesthetics. This option by Teraflex is going to do just that. It's going to create a really nice stance on your Wrangler, a really aggressive stance with a lower center of gravity, but it's also going to be the perfect blend between street and trail use. This is going to be a very comfortable lift kit, perfect for the daily driver, but it's also going to offer you those capabilities when you hit the trail, you're going to be able to conquer those trails. So this is a very inclusive lift kit. It comes with everything you need to get your Jeep up and off of the ground. It also comes with some tuned lower front control arms, perfect to correct some of that caster and pinion angles that we threw off, and it does come with the impressive Falcon 2.1 monotube shocks. So as far as tires goes, guys, this is going to fit up to a 35-inch tire. That's what's recommended for this. Now 33s are gonna look a little small in the wheel well, but it's gonna give you some more room for up travel while you're off-road. And as far as 37s go, you may be able to fit them on there. However, you're not gonna have a lot of room to work with, and you are going to rub from wheel lock to wheel lock. So as far as price goes, this is going to be roughly $1,800, making this a little bit more expensive than the average lift kit, but you do have to think about what you're getting in this kit compared to some other options. So lesser expensive options, they may not come with all of the components that you see here, including those lower control arms, and they may come with some more baseline options, considering that this comes with an upgraded shock. So comparing it to Teraflex's other lift kits, they may come with the standard 9550, as to where this comes with the middle ground Falcon monotube. So I definitely think if you're looking for a quality lift kit, but you're not looking to go completely over the top, then this is a great one to take a look at. So install is actually going to be a 2 out of 3 wrenches on this, guys. It's only going to take you about 6 hours to get everything bolted up. Everything is really bolt on. You do have a couple of places where you do have to drill, but the drilling is not hard, and you're going to need a number of different hand tools that we'll show you in just a moment. So speaking of this install, let's jump into that now. The tools that I used for my install were an impact wrench, a drill, an impact wrench, a cutoff wheel, an assortment of drill bits, specifically a 3/8 inch and a 5/8 inch, a pry bar, a breaker bar, a number of extensions, an assortment of ratchets, a trim removal tool. You will need an assortment of wrenches, standard and metric, the provided tool by Teraflex, an adjustable wrench, a pair of vice grips, safety glasses, an assortment of sockets and deep sockets and swivel sockets, an assortment of Allen keys, pliers, a marker, snips, vice grips, a center punch, a Phillips head screwdriver, a tape measure, WD-40, a hammer, a dead blow, and a flathead screwdriver. So the first thing you need to do is get your Jeep up in the air and your tires off. You can use a 19mm socket and an impact wrench or a breaker bar to do that. Next thing we're going to do is support our axle. So I have some pull jacks here, and I'm just going to put 2 underneath here, so when we drop our axle, everything is supported. Next thing we need to do is take off our sway bar link, so you can grab an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. So I'm going to use an 18mm deep socket and an 18mm wrench to remove this bottom bolt. So once you have the bottom bolt out of your one sway bar link, we need to move to the other side to do the same thing, so we can move this sway bar down and access our top stud. So to access the passenger side sway bar end link bolt, I am going to use a 18mm swivel, since this is in a tighter spot, and our 18mm wrench. So now we can pull our sway bar down so we can access our top stud a little bit easier. So in order to remove the top part of our sway bar link, we do need to hold our stud still with a 19mm wrench on the other side of our sway bar. Then we can take our 18mm socket and go ahead and remove that nut. So what you're going to do is grab a 19mm wrench. We're going to hold this stud still. And then we can grab our 18mm socket that we used earlier and go ahead and remove that top stud. So what I'm going to do now is disconnect our track bar from our axle, and since we are fully replacing our track bar, we can also disconnect it from our frame side too. I'm going to use a 21mm socket as well as an extension to clear our drag link here, and we can go ahead and remove our track bar bolt. So you will usually have a flag nut on the other side. This Jeep does not, so I am using a 7/8 inch wrench in order to hold that nut still. So now I'm going to remove the bolt out of our frame side of our track bar. I'm going to be using a 7/8 inch wrench to hold the nut on the other side and our 21mm socket that we used at the axle side to remove the bolt. So once both bolts are removed, we can fully remove our track bar. So what we're going to do next is remove our bottom shock bolt so we can drop our axle. I'm going to be using a 19mm swivel and a 19mm wrench. However, the factory bolt will be an 18mm socket and 18mm wrench. So what we're going to do next is fully remove our shock before we go ahead and lower our axle. Now we do need to remove the top shock nut. This can be an issue, so I do recommend soaking it with a penetrant like PB Blaster or WD-40 before you go ahead and remove it. So now I'm going to use a 16mm ratcheting wrench on the top part of our shock, and then I'm going to hold our shock body still with a 16mm open-ended wrench. So before we go ahead and lower our axle, we want to make sure that our brake lines are freed up so we're not stressing them out. I'm going to use a 10mm socket and remove it from our frame. So we're also going to remove our lower brake line bracket. We're going to be replacing this in the near future. I'm going to be using a 10mm ratcheting wrench to remove this bolt on the outside of our spring perch. So once that bolt is removed, we can fully remove our brake line bracket. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So now that everything's disconnected, what we can do at this point is lower our axle. So once we have our axle lowered enough, we can remove our spring. So our axle's still not low enough in order to get our new springs in, so what I'm going to do is disconnect our drive shaft. You want to make sure that you make a mark so it is oriented in the same way that it is bolted up right now. So I'm just going to take a Sharpie and mark the flange. And then we can take a 15mm swivel socket and remove the 4 bolts that are holding on our drive shaft. Now we are able to fully lower our axle to get ready for our new springs. So before I go ahead and show you how this lift kit is installed, I did want to show you guys on the table with some stock components and some new components, what benefits that you're getting out of this new lift kit in comparison to your stock ones. So right off the bat, shocks are a big thing. Shocks are what's going to give you your ride quality, and there's 2 schools of thought when it does come to shocks. You have a hydraulic shock and you have a gas charge shock. So your stock shock is going to be hydraulic. It's going to be really fluid-like and very comfortable, perfect for the daily driver, but it's not so great when it comes to performance because it does happen to be susceptible to shock fade over time. Now this lift kit comes with the Falcon 2.0 monotube shocks. They're going to be gas charged. They're going to separate that oil and gas to prevent any of that cavitation from happening, making them last a very long time. It's also going to have a 3/4 inch hardened chrome plated shaft, for some extra durability and to prevent any buckling. So moving down the line, you're also going to get your coils. That's what's going to give you the height out of this lift kit. These are going to be 2.5 inches larger than your stock coils. Now you also get a new adjustable track bar with this. This is going to be, like I said, adjustable. It's going to completely recenter your axle after we've thrown off some of that geometry, after we've lifted our Wrangler. Now it's also going to be 230% stronger than your stock track bar, so you can really count on it to hold up while you're out on the trail in comparison to your stock one. Now you're also getting a rear track bar relocation bracket with this. This is pretty standard in all lift kits. You don't necessarily need an adjustable track bar for the rear, but this is going to help center our rear axle. So another big component that you're getting out of this lift kit is front lower control arms. These are going to be pre-adjusted to have the perfect caster alignment after we've thrown everything off after lifting our Wrangler. These are going to have factory style bushings, however these still are going to provide full range of motion, and the control arms themselves are going to be a lot more durable than the factory. And then you are going to have those little components to accommodate for all of that height. So you are getting new sway bar links to accommodate for that 2.5 inches of lift. And what I also do like about that is it comes with quick disconnect hardware. So when you're at the trailhead, all you have to do is pull a pin for instant articulation instead of actually having to get underneath your Wrangler with a couple of tools and manually disconnect them. So those are the main big components that you're getting out of this lift kit. Now you are getting a lot of smaller components that are going to accommodate for that height change. You are getting some longer bump stops. You are getting some longer sway bar links for the front and the rear. So enough about all of these components on the table. Let's go ahead and bolt up our new lift kit. So we do have to replace our bump stops with our new speed bumps. So there are little tabs on your jounce tube that are holding in your bump stop. You can put a flathead screwdriver back there to kind of pry the bump stop out if it is giving you troubles. Usually there's not too much trouble with these, but this one seems to be giving us a little bit of an issue. All right, there we go. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So what we're gonna do now is install our speed bump stop. You wanna make sure that the notch is facing the front of the vehicle. As you can see, this is tapered. You wanna make sure that it's oriented in the correct way. I did put a little bit of grease on it to make sure that it slides in easier. And then you want a couple blocks of wood on the bottom of your spring perch. And we're just going to press this in by raising our axle. There she goes. And we can lower our axle back down and do the same thing on the other side. So what we need to do next is install our bump stop pad on our spring perch here. There is no hole there, so we will have to drill a hole in order to secure this down. So what I'm gonna do is just place this over top where we want it to be, take a center punch, and mark a center hole. So we do need to drill a 3/8 inch hole. I'm gonna start with an 11/64 inch drill bit. I'm gonna drill a pilot hole with this, then we can step it up to a 1/4 inch, and then finally a 3/8 inch. Also, make sure to wear your safety glasses. So after you drill your pilot hole, we're just going to step this up to a 3/8 inch drill bit. So a little WD-40 will help preserve your drill bit and it will help your cutting process. Now we're gonna install our bump stop pad. We're gonna put that where we drilled our hole, take our provided hardware. Now it's gonna be the 3/8 inch bolt. The front and the rear will be different. Now we can grab our flange nut and our provided tool by Teraflex. Put that up inside the spring perch. Once that's tightened into place, we can repeat that same process on the other side. So now that our speed bumps and our speed bump pads are in, we can make sure that our axle is low enough and we can pop in our springs. So I have the axle fully dropped right now, as far as it'll go, and our springs fit in perfectly. Now it's not gonna seat correctly when the axle is dropped, but once we raise it up and start to compress it, they will seat properly. So I'm just gonna raise up the axle to put a little bit of pressure on our springs. Make sure they seat a little bit better. So what we're gonna do now is move on to our control arms. I would like to mention that you do have to do these one at a time. You're gonna need a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench, and we're gonna go ahead and remove our first control arm. So now we can grab our new control arm and go ahead and install it. What I do really like about these is the fact that you don't have to use a knockout tool in order to knock out the control arm mount. These are already pre-adjusted and pre-tuned for a perfect caster alignment, like I said before, but you don't have to spend all that time cleaning up the axle for caster, because that is kind of a lengthy process when you want to get it done right. So we do want to tighten down our control arms when the Jeep is on its own weight. So right now our other control arm is fighting us in order to get our one control arm bolted up. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and unbolt the other one so we can get this one bolted in and the other control arm bolted up as well. So now that our other side is unbolted, we can move our axle how we need to. So now we can just thread on our nut. And now that we have one longer control arm on, it's going to push our axle forward, so when we go to install our new one, it's going to line up perfectly. So now we can just repeat that same process on the other side. So next step is we want to get in our shocks. However, we do need to bolt up our brake line to a new anchor to our shock bolt. Now what we need to do first is totally discard this bracket. This was mounted up underneath our spring perch here. However, these brake lines here, your soft line and your ABS line, are going to be installed on that new anchor, so we need to get this out of the way. So first I'm going to take a trim removal tool and just remove these clips that are holding on our ABS line. So once you have your ABS line removed from your bracket, you can get that out of the way. And what I'm going to do now is take a cutoff wheel and make a notch in this bracket. What Teraflex recommends to do is grab a pair of vice grips and pry this back so you can get your soft line out. However, this is incredibly hard to do, so what I'm going to do is just make a notch so it makes it a little bit easier. So what I've done here is just took a pair of vice grips, attached it to our shock mount. That's why I wanted to do this before we go ahead and put in our shock. And then I'm just going to make a small notch in our brake line bracket. Now you do have to be very careful with your soft line here. You don't want to go all the way through your bracket and destroy your soft line. We just want to make a notch so it's easier to bend back. So now we're ready to install our shock. You want to make sure that your top bushing is off and the top nut is off, because it will come pre-installed on your shock. Then we can just move this bottom bushing up a tad, so when we put this into place, we can align this tab with the hole in our shock tower. So what I had to do is actually take the tab off, align that in the hole, and then we can go ahead and align our shock, making sure that the tab is seated. Now we can take our top bushing and the top nut and thread that on. So So once you have the nut in hand, we can go ahead and thread that on, making sure that everything is seated properly. Now this is gonna be a nylon lock nut, so it's not gonna thread on all the way. You're gonna need a 19mm wrench, and we are just going to tighten that down. Now, the shock body will stay still because of that tab. We don't need to wedge an Allen key up there in order to make sure that this is tight. And we also wanna make sure that this is tightened down to 15 foot-pounds, which should be right around hand tight. You wanna make sure never to over tighten your shocks, or at least the top shock mount. So what you will notice about these Falcon shocks is that they're actually upside down. So usually our rod is up here, but we actually have the shock body up in our tower here and the rod down at the bottom. After that top shock bolt is tightened down, we can move to the lower shock bolt and attach our brake line anchor in the process. So what I'm just gonna do is tap this in. So what I'm gonna do is take our brake line anchor, wedge that in between. We'll mount up our brake lines. Just a moment. Take our factory bolt, get that through. Go ahead and put that up in the meantime, since that's where we're going to attach our brackets. So now we can go ahead and tighten this down. I'm going to be using the same 19mm swivel that I used before and an 18mm wrench on the other side. So what I'm going to do first is just snip off these clips because we won't be needing them. Those were for the other bracket. Just be careful not to clip your brake line there. Then we can just put our ABS line first. There's going to be a smaller channel down at the bottom. Just going to use a flathead and wedge that in. Then we can take our soft line, put that on top. Then we can take our provided zip ties that Teraflex gave us. They're going to be channels for zip ties. You're going to put 3 on each. Now you can repeat that same process on the other side. So what we're going to do next after we've installed both of our shocks is go ahead and attach our track bar. Now they do not measure this out for you. You will have to measure it out yourself. So for most standard lift kits, 33 inches from eye to eye on your track bar is a good starting point. And then once we have it installed down on the ground and back together, we can go ahead and adjust it and make sure our axle is completely centered. What we're going to do is just start to install this. We're going to install it with our factory hardware. So as you guys can see, our track bar is not lining up. It is at 33 inches, which makes it a great starting point for adjusting to recenter the axle completely. However, we're gonna have to attach that bolt while the Jeep is on its own weight. So what we can do in the meantime is just tighten up our top frame bolt with a 21mm socket and 21mm wrench. Now we are gonna go back and torque everything down, but we just wanna make sure that that is tight. When we put it on the ground, everything is intact. So what we can do now is move on to our sway bar end links, and like I mentioned before, this does come with quick disconnect hardware, so we're going to go ahead and install this now. What I'm going to do is just insert this pin facing the inside of our axle, put our flat washer on there, and then our nylon lock nut on the other side. So after that is in place, we can take a screwdriver, put that through the hole, make sure that stays in place. You also want to make sure that it's accessible because that's where your pin is going to be. So once that's tight, we can actually install our full sway bar end link, making sure that our Zerk fitting at the bottom is installed so we can easily maintenance them when we need to. So you can thread on that nut that came pre-installed on our end link. And we can grab a 6mm Allen key and a 19mm wrench and just go ahead and tighten that down. So once our one sway bar end link is installed, we can move to the passenger side and repeat that same process. So once you have the lower part of your sway bar end link on your pin, all you have to do is put on your larger washer and we can stick our pin through. All right, and it should sit like that, and then once you need to disconnect your sway bar end links on the trail, you can pull this pin and store it away in what we are going to install next. So what we can do now is put in our storage pin. So this is going to come with a bracket. It will be side specific. You want to make sure that you have the one for the correct side. Then we're going to take an 18mm deep socket, remove this body mount bolt. We can put our bracket on, put our bolt back on. Once that is threaded on, we can tighten that down with our same 18mm deep socket. Now we can thread our second pin on. This is going to be the smaller pin, and it's going to have 4 holes for your pin instead of 2. And you do have a nut that we need to put on the back of that. You can install this first or after you mount it up, doesn't matter. Now holding the nut on the other side with a 9/16 inch wrench, we can go ahead and just tighten that down. We can just use our screwdriver. So when you get to the trailhead, once you need to disconnect your sway bar end links, you pull this pin at the bottom here, move your whole sway bar up and out of the way, and then you can slide the bottom part of your sway bar end link on here and secure it down with that pin that is attached at the bottom. Now we can repeat that same process for the mount on the other side. So the last thing that we have to do in the front before we go ahead and bolt up our drive shaft is our exhaust spacers. Now these can be very tricky just because of the placement, also because the bolts tend to rust very quickly from all of the heating up and cooling down that the exhaust does. I recommend to soak them with a penetrant and even use heat on them in order to get them out. Now you will need a 13mm socket and a ratchet in order to remove those, so let's go ahead and do that now. So as predicted, the bolts did break. Now this is a very common issue, so don't be surprised if they do. However, if the bolts do break like ours did, all you have to do is drill out the other side of your exhaust, just on the other side of where that nut is, where it threads into your flange, and then you can put a nut on the other side. So what we can do now is go ahead and install our passenger side spacer. This is going to be your longer spacer. You may have to take a pry bar and just pry the exhaust away from each other to fit that in. Just make sure that this is separated. You will have to kind of play with the exhaust in order to get this in. Push it back as far as you can. Then we can take our provided bolts and the other hardware that you may have to outsource, i.e. the nut and washer on the back. We can go ahead and install that. Now if you have a 2007 to 2011 Wrangler, you won't need to do this. This is just for the 3.6 liter V6 engines. This is just so your drive shaft boot is not sitting on your exhaust after you have thrown off your geometry, since it will be sitting at a lower angle. Now normally these would just thread into the flange that's attached to your catalytic converter. However, we did, again, have to put on some different hardware. Now that our passenger side one is finished, we can go over to our driver's side and put in the smaller exhaust spacer. So now we can go ahead and tighten these down. I'm using a 13mm socket and a 13mm wrench. Now we can reinstall our bolts on our drive shaft, making sure that our drive shaft and our axle or our pinion flange is going to be lined up where we marked it. You also want to make sure that you are applying blue Loctite to the threads, and we can just thread in those bolts. Now we can just tighten those up with our 15mm swivel socket. Then we can also torque that while that's on the ground. Now we can go ahead and move to the rear. So the same thing goes for the rear. We do have to support our axle in order to drop it. Then what we can go ahead and do next is take out our rear shocks. So I'm going to use an 18mm socket and 18mm wrench to remove this bottom bolt. Usually we start with the sway bar, however it's a lot easier to get our rear shock out of the way in order to access our sway bar. So in order to free up that bolt, you may have to tinker with the height of the axle. So I'm going to use our 16mm swivel socket and a 15-inch extension to reach our top two shock bolts. And then there's our second, and after we remove both of those, we'll be able to fully remove our shock. So with the bottom shock mount being bolted in, it does get clamped onto here, so you can just use a small pry bar and just wiggle out that shock, and you'll be able to fully remove it. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. Now we can use an 18mm socket and an 18mm wrench to remove our sway bar link after our shocks are removed. And we can do the same thing on the other side. What we can do now is disconnect our rear track bar. We're going to have to install a rear track bar relocation bracket anyway, but this is going to allow us to drop our axle to get our springs out. I'm going to be using a 21mm socket, and there should be a flag nut on the back of here. There is, and we can go ahead and remove that. So what we're going to do next to make sure our brake lines are protected is just to remove them from our frame. I'm going to use a 10mm socket in order to do that.
So before we drop our axle, we do want to address our brake line bracket for our emergency brake. We are going to remove this bracket and completely discard it. You're going to need a 10mm deep socket. You can go ahead and remove the 2 nuts that are holding our bracket.
So now we're ready to lower our axle and pop out our springs. So what we can do next is move on to installing our new bump stops. First we have to get our factory bump stops out. So we can do the same thing that we did with the front and twist those out. You may need to use a flathead to get it unhooked from the tabs inside of that jounce tube. So now we can install our new jounce tube, making sure that the angled part, the tapered part, is facing the rear. You also have a little label saying which part needs to go into the front. So just like we did with our front, we want to evenly press this in. So I just grabbed our blocks of wood that we used earlier, and we're going to raise our axle to make sure this evenly goes around our jounce tube. Now we're going to be doing the same thing with the bump stop. We want to make sure that we do this separately. So now that our tubes are in place, we can go ahead and grab our new bump stop and wiggle that into place. Now we are going to press these in just like we did the tube as well as the front. So we're going to grab our blocks of wood again. We have to lower the axle just a little bit more. This is all just tinkering with the axle height. Once your blocks of wood are in place, we can go ahead and raise the axle and press in our bump stop. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. So our Jeep already does have bump stop spacers on it. We do need to remove those and add our Teraflex ones. So I'm going to be using a 9/16 inch wrench as well as a 14mm wrench to remove those. So now we're ready to install our Teraflex bump stop pad. You are going to tell that the holes are offset. You are going to have a longer portion of your bump stop pad. This longer portion, or this more spaced out portion, is going to be facing the front of your Wrangler, and then where the bolt hole is closer to the outside, that's going to be facing our rear. So that is also for clearance issues as well. So when we get over to the other side of the track bar, you're going to have to install your bolt on your track bar actually backwards with the nut facing the rear of the vehicle, so this clears. So with a 1/2 inch wrench and a 3/16 inch Allen key, we can go ahead and tighten that down to our axle. So once you get your axle low enough, we'll be able to pop in our springs using our factory isolators. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. You may want to lift it up to make sure your one spring is stationary. So what we're going to do next is attach our lower spring retainer. We're going to put that on our spring perch, attach the provided hardware. Then we can grab our provided tool by Teraflex, our flange nut, and our lock washer, and go ahead and put that into place. So once you have that threaded into the flange nut, we can take our 9/16 inch socket and a ratchet and go ahead and tighten that down. Once that's tightened down, we can repeat that process on the other side. So what we have to do now is install our upper spring retainer. This is making sure that when you're out on the trail, if you flex too far, your spring doesn't pop out of place. There is a hole on the top of our spring perch on the outer side near our frame. We're going to install that there with a nut on the other side of our spring perch. Now it is going to be a little bit hard to see because this is a tight area. So once your nut is attached, you can take two 19mm wrenches. I'm using a 3/4 inch and 19mm wrench. They're the same size, and we are going to go ahead and tighten it in. Oh. So once that's tightened down, we can move on to our brake line brackets. So as you can tell, we already do have a drop bracket on our brake line here. This was already installed when we got our Wrangler. So we're gonna go ahead and remove that and install our one by Teraflex. So you're gonna use an 11mm socket and an 11mm wrench if you already have one on there. If not, you're just gonna have to disconnect it from the frame. So what we can do now is grab our new Teraflex bracket. This is gonna be for either side. As you can tell, there's a notch on either side for this tab here. So we can leave that loose for just a second and reinstall our actual brake line bolt to our frame. It's that 10mm factory bolt. I'm just doing this so this stays stationary when we tighten it down. Then we're going to use that 11mm wrench and 11mm socket to tighten down our new brake line bracket bolt. Once that's tightened down, we can grab our 10mm socket, then we can tighten down our frame bolt. Now you can just repeat that process on the other side. So the Falcon shocks in the rear will relocate on the outside of our shock body, so we do need to install our bottom bolt and sleeve in here. However, we do need to drill out the outside hole in order to install that sleeve. So you're gonna grab a 5/8 inch drill bit and we're gonna go and drill that outside hole. Also grab some safety glasses. You always wanna be safe. So once we've drilled that hole, we can install our new bolt. So your sleeve is gonna go on the inside. Stick our sleeve through, attach our new washer and our new nut. Now we can install our new shock where we removed our old one. In the same top mounting location, using our factory hardware. So I do like on these new Falcon shocks that it doesn't have two teeth. It does have one tooth on the one side, and then the other side is an actual hole, so you don't have to worry about the shock wiggling out. So after we have those threaded in, we can take our 16mm socket, our swivel socket, and our extension, and tighten those down. So with the help of a little PB blaster on our new shock bolt, we can tinker with our axle height and install our new shock. So now with a 19mm socket and a 19mm wrench, we can go ahead and tighten that up. And that will seat your shock into place. So what we're going to do now is attach our new sway bar end links. That top stud is going to go through the top there. We can attach that at our sway bar. Then we can line up our bottom and use our factory hardware for the bottom. Again, you just have to play around with the axle height in order to get this to line up. Now we can tighten down this top stud with a 19mm wrench and a 6mm Allen key and a ratchet. So now we can tighten this down with an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. Because our shock is mounted up already, I am going to use an extension here. So in order to install our track bar relocation bracket, we do have to remove the bottom bolt on our lower control arm. You're going to need a 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench. Line that up where we need it to go. Then we can go ahead and reinstall this bolt before we go ahead and attach the rest of our bracket. Now, since this is one of our control arms, we are going to snug this up, but we're not going to tighten it down because the Jeep's down on its own weight. So now we can take our U-bolt and attach our hardware. You're going to have 2 flat washers and 2 nuts. So we're not going to tighten anything down yet. We want to grab our new bolt with the provided sleeve. We're going to install that where our track bar used to be. We're going to attach our new supplied nut on the back. This is going to be a little bit difficult. Then we can go ahead and tighten everything down. So starting with our actual bracket bolt, I'm going to use a 19mm socket and a 19mm wrench to go ahead and tighten that down. Now we can take that same 19mm socket and tighten up our U-bolt. So once you have your track bar in your bracket, it may line up, it may not. If it's not lining up correctly, we can put the Jeep down on its own weight and you can wiggle the rear end, or you could take a rod or an extension and just try to pull it over as best as you can. We were able to get it lined up. So what I'm going to do now is install our factory bolt. It may need a little bit of help going through, and we can grab our flag nut, our factory flag nut, and install that on the other side. Now it will catch, so we can grab our 21mm socket, tighten that down. So now while the Jeep is down on its own weight, we can tighten down our control arms and attach our front adjustable track bar. I have someone in the driver's seat. They're going to steer the wheels back and forth in order to get this lined up. So if you could turn driver. Now there should be a flag nut, however,
We do not have a flag nut on here. So I'm going to use a 7/8 inch wrench and our 21mm socket with an extension to clear our drag link. We'll go ahead and tighten that down. Now we can move on to tightening down our control arms. So now with our 21mm wrench and 21mm socket, we can tighten down our control arm bolts.
So after you've tightened everything down, you do need to torque everything to factory spec, and I would recommend an alignment as well, and then you're all set to go. So that's gonna wrap it up for my review and install. Make sure you like and subscribe, guys, and for more videos like this, always keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.